All right, this is Bonnie McFarland, and once again, welcome to our March State and Federal Programs Directors Meeting. We realize a lot of you are very, very busy right now. Many of you are involved with school openings and a lot going on. And so hopefully today we're trying to be succinct and provide you just what you need in terms of some overview of some information. We like to introduce our team who will be with us today, and that's Rachel Garcia, Amy Tomomatsu, Jeannie Keith, and Adrian Balcazar. And you'll notice there's one missing name there, and that's Evan Bartelheim. We're operating one short right now. Evan has moved over to the assessment project director's office. So fortunately, in the real world, that's right around the corner from us in our office. But Evan certainly will be connecting with him on assessment issues. But we are operating one short right now. So those of you who do have Evan as your LCAP contact, one of our other, we're spreading those districts around, and one of our other coordinators will be in touch with you to introduce themselves and offer their support and services. So we do have one new addition to our team. We have a new secretary who's joined us, Christine Jung, and so you may get information from her, and hopefully she'll be sitting in with us today to get a sense of who you are and get to know her. So welcome, Christine. Good to have you with us. All right, well, let's take a look at the agenda for today. You can see our list is a little bit shorter than usual. As I said, we were cognizant of your schedules and everything that's going on, and there are a few things, but some of them are rather deep and new. First, we want to take a look at the AB 86, the new plan requirements and some considerations regarding that, and that's for the expanded learning program. So Rachel's going to take us through that and take a look at those requirements. Also, we want to take an overview of the other stimulus, federal stimulus funding, where things are on that, and also implications for your work. And next, we're going to have an assessment update. There's been some movement with the state board, and there's some things that need to be clarified. That's led to some maybe more confusion than clarity at this time, but Amy, as always, will straighten us out on that. An LCAP update from Jeannie, and then federal program monitoring, some changes in those instruments that have been around, and Adrian's going to walk us through that piece. So as usual, questions, please type them in the chat box, and we'll do a Q&A afterward, particularly on these topics. Some of them I know we're going to have to do some research to get you answers, and some of them there may not yet be answers to, because some of them are still evolving. But so we probably won't be able to answer many as we don't like to off the top of our heads anyway, but especially with some of these topics. So put your questions in the chat, and we will respond in a Q&A to you. So, and this is where you can find all our previous Q&As from our previous meetings. So if you want to go back and look at any of them there. Also, this meeting, as always, is being taped, and it will be posted along with the slides and any handouts on our website. So you can access everything there. So I think that's all the 1, 2, 3s are getting started. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to talk about perhaps the newest information, and that's Assembly Bill 86 and the plan for that. Rachel?
Thank you, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone. So as Bonnie mentioned, in this section, we have some updates regarding Assembly Bill 86 and the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grants. Next slide. So Assembly Bill 86 was approved on March 5th and provides $2 billion for in-person instruction grants and $4.6 billion for expanded learning opportunities grants. The CDE has indicated that there is no application to receive AB 86 funding, and that in May, LEAs will receive 50% of their allocation for both the in-person instruction grants and the expanded learning opportunities grants. The remaining 50% less any reduction or forfeiture of in-person instruction grants will be provided to LEAs in August 2021. And the CDE has cautioned LEAs that the in-person instruction apportionment and retention of funds is contingent on meeting the criteria for in-person instruction in Assembly Bill 86. LEAs are advised not to budget for in-person instruction funding if it does not plan to offer in-person instruction pursuant to Education Code Section 43521C3 by May 15th, 2021. And estimated allocations for in-person instruction and expanded learning opportunities grants have already been posted to the CDE website. And we've included the link on slide 14, which is our CDE resources slide. Next slide. So in this section, we're going to focus on the expanded learning opportunities grants. And so this is one-time funding for supplemental instruction and support to benefit disadvantaged student groups who have faced adverse learning and social emotional circumstances due to the pandemic. So as mentioned, there is no application to receive this funding. However, as a condition of receiving expanded learning opportunities grants funds, LEAs must develop a supplemental instruction and support plan to support students identified as needing academic, social, emotional, and other supports. And the plan must be adopted by the local governing board or body on or before June 1st, 2021, and submitted to the County Office of Education, CDE, or chartering authority as applicable within 5 days of adoption. LEAs may expend funds prior to the adoption of the plan, and funds must be expended by August 31st, 2022. Next slide, please. So districts have the ability to decide on what services they want to provide based on local need and the allowable purposes of the funds. And there are 7 supplemental instruction and support strategies that are identified in Education Code Section 43522B that may be supported with expanded learning opportunities grants funds. And LEAs are required to use the funds for any of these 7 purposes. And this includes extending the instructional learning time in addition to what is required for the 2021-22 and 2022-23 school years. This can be done by increasing the number of instructional days or minutes, providing summer school, or any other action that increases the amount of time or services provided to students. Also, accelerating progress to close learning gaps through implementation, expansion, or enhancements of supports. And this may include tutoring, one-on-one or small group supports provided by certificated or classified staff, learning recovery programs and materials to accelerate academic proficiency and or English language proficiency, and also training for certificated and classified staff in strategies to accelerate learning and address learning gaps. Next slide, please. So other allowable purposes include integrated student supports to address other barriers to learning, such as health, counseling, or mental health services, before and after school programs, and programs that address trauma and social emotional learning, or referrals for support to address family or student needs. Also, community learning hubs to provide students with access to technology or high-speed internet or other academic supports. Another allowable purpose is supports for credit deficient students. Also, additional academic services such as diagnostic assessments, progress monitoring, or benchmark assessments. And the last allowable purpose is training for school staff on strategies to engage students and families in addressing student social, emotional, and academic needs. Next slide, please. So there are also a few other requirements for the use of these funds. Per Education Code Section 43522, at least 85% of the funds must be used for expenditures related to providing in-person services in any of the 7 allowable purposes that were just described. Another requirement is that LEAs must use at least 10% of these funds to hire paraprofessionals to provide supplemental instruction and support for the duration of the program, with the priority for full-time paraprofessionals. The funds used to hire paraprofessionals count towards the 85% requirement for in-person services. It's also required that the supplemental instruction and support provided by these paraprofessionals be prioritized for English learners and students with disabilities. Additionally, an LEA may use up to 15% of funds to increase or improve services for students in distance learning, or for activities to prepare the LEA for in-person instruction before the services are actually offered. Next slide, please. So the CDE is required to develop and post the plan template on the CDE webpage within 21 days of approval of AB 86. And CDE hosted a webinar last Friday, March 19th, to share the draft template and also seek input regarding the proposed template and instructions. And you can see screenshots of the draft template and instructions on the bottom of this slide. The template is scheduled to be released by CDE sometime today, March 25th. And there are 6 components specified in the Education Code, Section 43522E, that must be included in the plan template. And we'll take a look at these 6 components on the next 2 slides. So first, the plan must include a description of how the LEA will assess student needs. Also, a description of how parents and guardians of students requiring supplemental instruction and supports will be informed of the availability of these opportunities. And this also includes how the LEA will provide this information in the parents' or guardians' primary languages. And also a description of the process the LEA used to involve parents and school staff, including both classified and certificated staff, in the development of the plan. Next slide, please. The plan must also include a description of the LEA's plan to provide supplemental instruction and support in a tiered framework based on universal, targeted, and intensive supports, and provides the services through a program of engaging learning experiences in a positive school climate. The template must also include the LEA's expenditure plan for expanded learning opportunities grant funds, and a description of how the funds will be coordinated with ESSER funds received by the LEA. One additional thing to keep in mind is that the LEA will also need to report out actual expenditures, and the CDE has indicated that LEAs will need to update the plan with the actual expenditures by December 1st, 2022. Next slide, please. So the CDE has created the COVID-19 Relief and School Reopening Grants webpage, which will provide additional resources related to in-person instruction grants and expanded learning opportunities grants. As previously mentioned, the estimated funding results for these grants have already been posted to this page. They're still working on this webpage, so you will see a number of items listed as coming soon, such as the frequently asked questions. And this is also the page where they will be posting the plan template. So be on the lookout. Sometime today, that plan template will be posted. Another item that's noted as coming soon is a certification form for the in-person instruction grants. And again, although there is no application to receive funding, LEAs will be required to submit a certification form for in-person instruction funds by June 1st, 2021. So basically, a plan will need to be submitted for the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant Funds, and also a certification form for the in-person instruction grant funds, with both of these items due by June 1st, 2021. And that concludes my section. So now I will turn it back over to Bonnie.
All right, thank you, Rachel. All right, now we want to turn to some of the federal stimulus funding that's available. We want to briefly review some of these multiple one-time federal funds that have been released to LEAs or are on the way in response to COVID, and also look at them in terms of the implications for your work. Some of you may have attended the CDE workshop that Brustein Manasevit put on just yesterday on this topic. They went much more in depth in each of these. What we want to do, give you an overview and again, make linkages to how it's acting what you do every day. So let's move ahead and take a look at kind of an overview here. First of all, the bottom line, there's a lot of money coming to schools and districts and addressing COVID. And as we said, there's more on the way. And this is all in addition to what Rachel just talked about, the AB 86 funds. It's a good thing that the funds are there, but you've probably already seen some of the challenges that it's created. And that one factor is that much of the funding is focused on the same student groups, and the focus of many of the programs that are included are similar to some of the programs you're working with. So the challenge for districts is really how to use all of those funds appropriately and effectively within a time period, because unlike most state funds, all of these funds have a timeline for expending them, as do your other federal ESSA funds. So all of that is sort of needs to be in your head as you're thinking about all of these funds. So let's start out by looking at some of the funding sources and the timelines. So on this slide are the dates for the expenditure of the funds. And you'll notice in each case, there's 2 dates listed. That's because, as with your other ESSA programs, these programs are all subject to the Tidings Amendment, which provides an additional year for educational programs. Now, we've mentioned Tidings before, but it hasn't had a significant implication for you because that's built into the timeline for ESSA. So you know you have 27 months to spend all your federal Title I, II, III, and IV funds, and that additional year includes the additional Tidings timeline. So you may see different dates for these programs, and that's because the date stated in the law is the first date, but Tidings allows you an additional year. So the final date, so for the CARES Act, that would be September 30th, 2022. It's scheduled to end. The obligation period would end in September 30th, 21, but with Tidings, it gives you an extra year. The new COVID Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, which has 2 names. Let me see. The CDE is calling it Carissa, but there's another name. It's pronounced differently in another one, but we'll get the acronym straight soon. But anyways, you can see those funds would be September 30th, 24 with the Tidings Amendment. And then the American Rescue Plan, because it was passed just shortly after the Carissa funds, would have also a September, that should say September 30th end date. So each of these funding sources includes the same funds that you got under the CARES Act, and that is the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Funds, ESSER funds. So you'll see that referred to as ESSER 1 under CARES, ESSER 2 under CARISA, and ESSER 3 under the American Rescue Plan. So there's ESSER is the same, essentially the same program, although there've been a few changes in them for each of the bills, and we'll take a look at those in a minute. Again, and for each of those programs, 90% of the ESSER funds are allocated through the Title I formula. So basically for focuses on low income numbers. Now the other two, CARES and CARISA, the first two programs also include the Governor's Emergency Relief Funds, GEAR funds. The third, the American Rescue Plan, does not include GEAR funds. And as you know, the GEAR funds are allocated not directly to LEAs, but to the state, and then the state makes determinations as to how those funds filter down to LEAs. All right, so the current status on them, CARES Act ESSER funds were available to districts late spring. They were the first ones out of the door. So last spring of 2020, those funds were available for districts, and they could be used back to the time March when the coronavirus closure started. GEAR funds were a little bit later coming out. They came through the state, but they were available to districts in the summer of 2020 through the Learning Loss Mitigation Funds. This was how the state determined that those funds would be allocated out to districts. They were included with two other funding sources, the coronavirus relief funds, and those are not education department funds, but they are federal funds outside the education department allocated to states. The governor determined those would be included in the learning loss mitigation funds, and also some state general funds were included in that funding package. CARISA and ESSER 2 allocations were just posted on the CDE website. So you can go to that link and find them, and those funds should be flowing soon, but the allocations are available so you can look and see how much is coming to your district. And the American Rescue Plan funds were just received by the California Department of Education this week, and CDE has 60 days to allocate those out to LEAs. So within a couple months, you should see those funds coming. This one has a different additional requirement, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and that is that LEAs must have a safe return to in-person instruction plan in place within 30 days of receipt of those funds. So again, you receive the funds in 60 days. 30 days after that, you need to have a plan in place. We're expecting additional information from CDE regarding plans that you might already have in place that would meet this requirement, or if there's going to be a need for any adjustment on that. But the law does allow plans that meet the requirements to be used, so it may not require an additional plan, but we'll be holding tight for more information on that. Right, another change on the next slide is the equitable services requirement. This is the good news part of the presentation, and we've mentioned this before, but ESSER and GEAR 1 under the CARES Act, as you recall, required LEAs to provide equitable services to nonprofit private schools. And that was all the challenges we faced last year with conflicting information from the US Department of Education, a number of lawsuits. And so those funds, a lot of those funds were late in getting to private schools because districts didn't have clear guidance on it. Under LEAs are not required to provide equitable services under the ESSER 2 and GEAR 2, which is in the CARISA Act, or under the American Rescue Plan. So under the two new funding sources, LEAs are relieved of that responsibility. However, private schools are still eligible through a separate program established, and that's under those two new funding sources, and it's the emergency assistance to non-public schools. So it's a separate funding stream. It's provided through the state education department, and it's along with the GEAR funds that go to the governors. So non-public schools have to submit an application to receive services or assistance, but that goes through the State Department. So However, if you didn't expend your ESSER or GEAR funds under the CARES Act that you reserved for equitable services, and that might be very likely because of all the misinformation that we received relative to how those funds should be determined. If you haven't spent those yet, you still need to spend those funds in the current school year. So you should be spending those ESSER and GEAR equitable services reservations from the CARES Act. But once that's gone, no need to move forward with any other equitable services. Keep in mind the equitable share under CARES is based on the number of low-income students residing in Title I school attendance areas who attend eligible nonprofit private schools. So it's the same as your Title I formula for equitable services. So that's equitable services under CARES. You still need to meet that obligation. The obligation is under the state from here. So next is the use of funds. And ESSER 1 under the CARES Act includes 12 allowable use of funds, and you can find those listed on the CDE website. We won't go through all of those here because you've had those funds for a while and probably are familiar with them. But two things to keep in mind relative to that is that there are two particular allowable cost items in that 12 that provide considerable flexibility and also impact your lives. And one is that it includes any activities authorized under ESSA, under IDEA, under the Adult Literacy Act, under Perkins, CTE, or McKinney-Vento. So that includes a lot of programs that you folks work with. So that's a crossover, you see. So those are, that can be challenging because the funds can be used for the same services that you're currently providing. The other is the last one, which is very broad. It just says other activities that are necessary to maintain operation and continuity of services in the LEAs and continuing the employment of staff. So you can see that those two broad areas actually cross over into your world and have to figure into your decision making as to how you're using the funds under ESSER and the funds under your other ESSA programs. ESSER, too many S's here. All right, so let's take a look at some changes in the allowable use. So I said there were 12 allowable uses to start with, but there have been some additions and modifications under the two new programs. So ESSER 2 and 3 include all the same allowable use of funds as under the CARES Act with the following exceptions. So ESSER 3, which is the funds that will be coming under the American Rescue Plan, include a separate funding stream for homeless youth. So you'll find in that, on the previous slide, when I listed all the ESEA programs that the funds can be used for, McKinney-Vento is not in that list under the new funding source, the American Rescue Plan. That's because there's a separate funding stream just for homeless youth. So that's one thing that's a change. Another change, it's a slight change, but it changes the focus from planning to implementation. Okay, so they're really the verbiage in there moves from planning for services during school closures to implementation of those services. So not a big change, but a shift in focus. Another addition is evidence-based full-service community schools is added to the mental health supports as an allowable use. And under ESSER 2 and 3, there's an addition of learning loss, including assessments, assistance to parents, tracking attendance, improving engagement. So learning loss was not under the CARES Act. Learning loss is now in the other two. And as we'll see in a minute, under ESSER 3, it adds a stricter requirement because it adds a 20% requirement for learning loss. So 2, it's just an allowable use of funds. Under ESSER 3, it's a requirement. ESER 2 and 3 also included some allowable use under facility repairs, inspection, maintenance, including improvements to air quality. So some additional allowable costs there. Also under ESER 3, on the next slide, we'll see a little bit more about that learning loss. Oop, something happened. But it will come back. I'm sure it will. Under ESER 3, as we mentioned, districts have to, or
Sorry.
that's okay. We'll come back. We've all lived with this. Under ESER 3, as we said, you have to have at least a 20% reservation for learning loss mitigation, right? So this includes, whoops, can we move to the next slide, please? Good. Okay, includes after school, summer school, extended day, and learning. And this is targeted to ESEA subgroups. Okay, so those groups, again, the students that you serve under your ESSA programs, homeless and foster youth. Again, you see some crossover again in the programs that Rachel talked about earlier. So, and real focus. And it also requires, as we mentioned earlier, this safe return to in-person instruction plan that has to be made publicly available within 30 days of receiving the funds. It does require public comment, and you may use other plans that meet the requirements. So we're hoping to get more on that soon, right? And it does add something called a maintenance of equity requirement. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. The LEA allocations under ESER 2 are now posted at this link, so you can see that's where to find your allocations for ESER 2. Why that's there. All right, next, a few reminders. And ESER, as I said, it'll be probably about 60 days before CDE has to post the third round of funding. Couple reminders, reporting requirements. All three of these funding sources have to be tracked separately. So you can't, your business people need to know. They can't just be dumped into a pot of federal stimulus. That each one of them has to be tracked and monitored separately. There's also separate quarterly reporting requirements for each fund source. So important to be aware of that. Information about the timelines and the process for those reporting are on the CDE website. And just a note, the deadline for expending the coronavirus relief funds, those are the funds under CARES that were in the GEAR program that are not under the Education Department. Those will be, the timeline for that was moved to June 30th. And so CD has indicated that if you haven't spent those funds, they may be checking in on you. So just know you have to track the funds, each of them separately. Also a reminder that the funds are subject to the requirements of the Code of Federal Regulations 2 CFR 200, and that includes, again, things that you're pretty familiar with. Internal controls. You have to show you have internal controls in place for use of these funds. Time and effort reporting requirements are required for ESSER and GEAR funds. Equipment inventory and control. So equipment purchase with those funds needs to be included on your equipment inventory. Capital expenses, prior approval for capital expenses, again, a requirement under the Code of Federal Regulations. And there are a number of others, but one that is important to you is sub-recipient monitoring. And what that means is that the recipient agency, which DE is responsible for monitoring the program, and that will be done through the FPM process. So you can see currently on the CDE compliance website is a CARES monitoring instrument, and it's posted up there. It's only covers CARES funds. It will be, it's being revised currently to reflect the new funding sources. So you can watch for that, but know that that's going to be in part of the FPM process through fiscal monitoring. All right, so capital expenditures we mentioned, and that is CARES Act. All three of these are going to require prior approval for capital expenditures. So currently the CD website indicates that CARES Act and the Carissa Act both require that ESSER and GEAR that any expenditures with a unit cost of $5,000 or more have prior written approval. And there's a link to that form on the CDE website. This will also apply to the new American Recovery Plan or American Rescue Plan funds. So all of them require prior approval for anything $5,000 or more per unit cost. So know that that's again a requirement of the Code of Federal Regulations for those funds. Okay. Let's take a look at GEAR 2 funds. And again, keep in mind, GEAR funds are the governor's emergency education relief funds. So they are not allocated directly to LEAs. They're allocated to states. Under the CARES Act, the GEAR funds were included in the learning loss mitigation funds, and they were all part of that package and were subject to those state requirements. The allocation methodology and allowable uses for GEAR 2 under the Carissa are going to be determined through the state budget process. So that's not, we don't know if that will again be under learning loss mitigation or if there will be some other process, but how those are going to be allocated and the allowable uses will be part of the state budget. So we're going to have to wait to see what's going to happen there. All right, also new under the American Recovery, the American Rescue Plan, all right, shouldn't use acronyms until I'm solid on the terms, okay? The American Rescue Plan includes this maintenance of equity requirement, and it applies at both the state and the local level, and it applies to fiscal years 2022 and 23, so years coming up, because this is for the new funding. Essentially, it says that the state has to ensure that any cuts to state funding in those years for high need districts are less than any overall reduction in state funding across the state on a per student basis. So bottom line, they can't cut high poverty districts more than other districts. And the same applies at the LEA level. LEAs can't reduce per pupil funding for high poverty schools more than the total reduction in the LEA's funding divided by the number of students. So again, you may have to reduce funding overall, but you can't reduce it to your highest poverty schools more than you can for other schools. And the same applies to LEAs can't reduce per pupil full-time equivalent staff in high poverty schools more than the total reduction that they would district-wide divided by the number of students in the LEA. And again, high poverty schools are essentially your top 25% highest poverty schools on your Title I ranking. Although the U.S. Department of Education will be defining what that low income measure is. So more information on that to come, that's out in the future. This is kind of similar to maintenance of effort, but just a little bit different twist on it for these is bottom line, the funds are really meant to serve high poverty schools. You can't just cut funding to those schools and say we'll fill it in with the new federal funding. There are some exceptions to that, and these are similar to some of the other exceptions on comparability. If you have under 1,000 students, a single school district, if you just have one school per grade, then these are not applicable. And also there is a waiver process for any exceptional or uncontrollable circumstances. So that will be out in the future, but something to be considering. So on the next slide, we just kind of put together a sort of an overview of all of these programs, plus your basic programs, to give you a thinking map sort of as to what similarities, what differences, and how you make some decisions. So you can see there are some ongoing funding and others are one-time funding. The way you use one-time funding is different from how you can use ongoing funding, Okay, keep in mind, one-time funding staff is not a great idea with one-time funding because it's going to be gone, and how will you support those people? So something to keep in mind. So you have in California, you have your LCFF base funding for all students and student groups, and it's ongoing. It does require a plan, your LCAP, your supplemental funds for low-income English learners and foster youth. Also, the increased and improved services requirement is part of your LCAP. And these are ongoing funding sources. So you need to think about those when you're planning. These are funds that you can count on moving forward. The others are all one time. So your AB 86 supplemental instruction, again, the program focus is on learning loss and achievement gaps. And the priority is low income and English learners. So you have two priority groups that are also priorities in other programs you have, but this is one-time funding, and it does require a plan. So you folks are the experts on planning, I'm sure. So how do these plans work together is something you might want to consider. The other three are the three federal funding programs, and very similar, all of them one-time funding. The first two, CARES and CARISA, no plan required, but the American Rescue Plan, there is going to be a plan required. And again, we'll hear more about that. So what's it's primarily, you have the 12 allowable costs, including any allowable activity and activities to maintain the operation of the LEA. So pretty broad in all three of those. And then the first CARES went to LEAs most impacted by COVID, also focused on unique needs of low-income students, students with disabilities, English learners, foster youth, and your racial ethnic minorities. So some of those, again, cross over some of those unique to this program. Learning loss focus in the second two funding sources, CARISA and the American Rescue Plan. Learning loss as a one area that's allowable under the first, and under the second is the required reservation for those after school or extended programs. Okay, and again, focus for ESEA subgroups, foster and homeless youth. You can see some of those are applicable to your LCFF supplemental. On the next page, we just thought we also, for your thinking, go into the ESSA programs, just to review, just so you can see where some of the crossovers are. Again, Title I, closing achievement gaps, academically at-risk students in high poverty schools. So a lot of crossover there. Okay? Title II, again, there's a prioritization requirement in Title II for your low-income schools. So high poverty schools for both Title II and Title IV have a prioritization. And again, Title III, English learners is another one of the groups in the other programs. All right, let's take a look. Next, we just want to kind of pull it together with some kind of big ideas to leave you with, and that's that, you know, most of students have experienced learning loss during school closures, but some groups have faced greater challenges during this time. And these are primarily the student groups who've had low levels of achievement. So the result of school closures is likely increased achievement gaps, and that's a concern statewide and nationwide. Okay? So that's recognized, and you can see that in the funding. The needs of each of these groups differ. And so to put in your thinking, keep in mind, a one-size-fits-all response isn't going to be effective. So the question becomes, how is your LEA considering the underlying factors impacting each of these student groups? Okay? The outcome may be the same. You may have a lot of students who are underachieving, but the reasons for that underachievement may be very different for a student with disabilities than a homeless student than an English learner. So if you can think deeply about those needs and use your funding sources appropriately. The next is just, again, thinking about what are some of those underlying causes of low achievement for vulnerable student groups, and then connecting the support that best addresses that. Attendance may be an issue for a lot of your students, but attendance issues for a student with disabilities may have a different cause than for a low-income student for whom it might be transportation issues or other things that interfere. All of these are groups that are identified in the COVID relief programs. So put all of those into your thinking and see how they cross over with other programs and figure out what's the most appropriate funding source to address the needs of each of those groups. And for you, our suggestion is that now is the time for you to be thinking out of the box. Well, let's take a look at that first. Some other considerations for determining funding, and that is for a lot of activities, there are going to be multiple funding sources that can be used for the same cost. Okay? And so you might think about what's the purpose of this particular funding source, and then who are the intended recipients, and that might narrow it down. Well, you have two funding sources, they both address homeless, which then look at what restrictions are placed on the use of the costs. Okay, are there restrictions in that program that are not going to fit your need? And another one is more flexible. Is the cost ongoing or is it temporary? Is this something that we're going to do something and it's going to be a temporary thing? We're going to do this and it's only for this period of time, or is this going to be something we want to install a program that is going to be ongoing? What consultation, planning, approval requirements are associated, and what's the locus of decision making? Is it at the district or is it at the school? Who should be making those decisions? So all of those just things to keep in mind as you're determining how to use those funds. Okay. And yes, this is when we say it's time to think out of the box. A lot of you, and I've heard from some of you, that you're struggling to find ways to spend some of your funding sources, and you're concerned because the timelines are coming up and you're saying other programs are sort of they're paying for things we used to offer. So it's up to you to think out of the box now. We're in different times, and what we need are new and exciting solutions, and look at it as an opportunity to look at new ways to serve our students. And finally, just wanted to update you on where we are with some funding, along with the American Rescue Plan. Was in a budget package that included our ESEA programs. So the federal budget, it increases, it shows increases for all ESSA programs, Title 1, 2, 3, 4, including 4B with just 21st Century Learning Centers. Also increases for IDEA, Perkins state grants. The increases are not huge. Title I appears to have the largest increase, but again, they're not huge, but they are increases, and no programs are cut in the federal budget. Keep in mind that even though there's a federal increase, that doesn't mean it's going to trickle down to the district, because there are allocation procedures in the state, including hold harmless, which means if a district fell below the 85% hold harmless, then other districts' funds may have to be used to cover those costs. So and individual LEAs may have experienced changes in census data, low income numbers, that can change your allocation. For charter schools and county office, it would be your free and reduced lunch counts that are used, and those may have changed. So things can change, but overall, for planning purposes, it's good news. Funding looks very stable for your ESEA programs. Also keep in mind your timelines. The obligation period for 2018, 19, and 1920 ESSA, Title 1, 2, 3, and 4, all of those end on September 30th of this year, unless we see a waiver for 1920 funds. As you recall, we got a waiver for 18-19, but that waiver is coming to an end this September. We also have 1920 funds that now are reaching the end of their 27-month period of obligation. So you might want to go to the CD website if you're not sure where you are. check on finance and grants and look at your allocations for various programs, see if you have a significant amount that you need to be thinking about spending. And currently CDE is still subject to the once every 3-year carryover waiver approval timeline for Title I. So if you've had a carryover waiver of the 15% carryover maximum, if you've had that within the last 3 years, last year CDE was able to still approve it because of the waiver. This year we have not seen a waiver in place for that. So you may, if you have more than 15% carryover, that could be problematic. So now's a good time to start looking at those funding amounts on the CDE website and making plans to spend those funds. All right, I think it's time to have a new topic and a new person, and that's Amy, who's going to talk about assessment updates.
Yes, thank you, Bonnie. Hi, everyone. This is Amy. And next, we're going to provide a brief update on assessment. Next slide, please. So this first slide will just provide kind of an overview of some of the actions and discussion that our State Board of Education has had over the last few months. So as you might recall, back in November of 2020, the State Board of Education adopted a condensed version of the Smarter Balanced ELA and math test. And that was in response to a federal letter telling states not to expect testing waivers for the 2020-21 school year, and in anticipation of the challenges that LEAs would continue to face during the pandemic. In February 2021, 2 days actually after the release of the U.S. Department of Education's letter, that letter, which stated that it would not be inviting states to apply for blanket waivers. And it also, the letter outlined flexibilities that would be available to states and the availability of waivers for certain accountability and reporting requirements. So the State Board at that meeting took action to direct CDE to pursue options and to prepare a waiver. So they had a lot of discussion around that. And then in March 2021, the State Board followed up on that February motion on the waivers and approved the CD's plan for the 2020-21 school year assessments that provides data to parents, educators, and the public by monitoring the progress of students in ELA and math. So we're going to take a little look at what that March 2021 meeting action looked like. So next slide, please. So here first, we're looking at the key components of the assessment waiver. On March 8th, the U.S. Department of Ed released a new accountability waiver template for states. And so CDE took that and used it to prepare and submit a streamlined waiver. The waiver will decouple accountability requirements from this year's assessment. It will also suspend identification of schools for support and improvement and waive federal participation rate penalties. In addition, it will extend the test administration window for CASP and LPAC to July 30th, and it will request relief from the administration of the science tests. So these are all part of the waiver that has recently been submitted. Next slide. As for the other discussion around the 2020-21 assessment plan, the State Board has approved a plan which allows the LEAs to use the most viable option for assessments in their local context. And so as long as the assessments meet certain criteria, and those would be that they must be aligned to the California state standards, that students must be assessed in grades 3 through 8 and 11, and they must be assessed uniformly across a grade span district or school, and be able to provide reportable results disaggregated by student group. Public reporting will remain a requirement in the SARC and the LARC, which requires performance of students by assessment type, number and percentage of students tested and not tested, and also disaggregated by student group. So CDE staff did also signal, though, that they are working on state legislation to ensure that these flexibilities are also reflected in state law. So that will be something that to monitor moving forward. And then the next slide. The CDE recently posted some guidance that outlines those additional criteria that we just discussed in the last slide, and that those are the criteria that LEA must consider if determining whether their local assessments meet the approved flexibility plans requirements. There's also a new FAQ, and I've just kind of screenshotted the questions that are posted in the FAQ, but the link there will take you to the actual website on CDE. And so they have that new FAQ and guidelines on the COVID-19 assessment FAQ page. So in alignment with the state board action earlier this month, the 2020-21 spring assessment flexibility guidelines were published and offer a path forward for each LEA to determine assessment type based on their local situation and needs. Please note that the guidance also outlines additional criteria that the LEA must consider in determining if local assessments meet the approved flexibility plans requirements. And so once it's approved by the U.S. Department of Education, so we don't have that final approval quite yet, but the guidelines will allow LEAs to use that most viable option for assessment in their local context, including the Smarter Balanced Summative Assessment and the California Alternate Assessments for ELA and Math, or other diagnostic, benchmark, or interim assessments that meet all of the criteria. And so we'll continue to await an update regarding the approval of the waiver, and we're hopeful that LEAs will be updated soon. So more information to come, but that is kind of the state of where we are at with assessment right now. And that's the last slide there. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeannie for the LCAP update.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everyone. This is Jeannie. The LCAP update today, we'll start with, if you can go, thank you, Adrian, for going to the next slide, with the summary of legal requirements. And we wanted to share with you just some additions that have been made to the summary and a few clarifications. The revision includes the new budget overview for parents template, which was approved in March, and we'll go over the components of that on the next slide. Additionally, regarding charter schools, the summary includes the requirement for charter schools to hold a public hearing to adopt the LCAP per Ed Code 47606.5 and a public hearing to solicit recommendations and comments from the public regarding specific actions and expenditures proposed to be included in the LCAP. It's noted that the Ed Code does not specify that the public hearing to solicit recommendations and comments from members of the public and the public hearing to adopt the LCAP has to be held at a separate meeting for charter schools. So we've made some clarification so that's more clear in the summary of legal requirements. Additionally, the summary addresses Ed Code 64001J that provides the requirements for single school districts and charter schools selecting to use the local control and accountability plan to serve as their SPSA, provided that the LCAP meets federal school planning requirements and the stakeholder requirements established in subdivision A of section 52062 and is adopted at a public hearing pursuant to section 52062. And so these requirements are noted with an asterisk in the summary document for your reference. And so with these requirements that are in subdivision A of 52062, this addresses where the superintendent of a district presented the local control and accountability plan and the annual update draft to a parent advisory committee for review and comment. And so if a charter school's using their SPSA as their LCAP, they are required to follow this same requirement. So they need to present the draft LCAP to the parent advisory committee for review and comment. and the related requirement, they also need to respond in writing to comments they receive from the Parent Advisory Committee. Additionally, that requirement for presenting the draft LCAP to the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee applies, to present the draft for review and comment, and to additionally respond in writing to input and comments from this committee. And additionally, the charter school would also need to provide the opportunity for members of the public to have an opportunity to submit written comments regarding specific actions and expenditures proposed in the learning continuity plan. And then additionally, prior to adoption, the requirement to consult with the special education local plan area administrator or administrators to determine that specific actions for individuals with exceptional needs are included in the LCAP and are consistent with strategies included in the annual assurances support plan for the education of individuals with exceptional needs. That requirement would apply. And so the asterisks have been updated in the summary of legal requirements so that this is clear. Additionally, we have noted that there are under the required metrics for pupil achievement, there are three among the multiple measurements for pupil achievement. Individually, a metric needs to be included for the percentage of pupils who have successfully completed A to G requirements, a separate metric for the percentage of pupils who have successfully completed CTE courses from approved pathways, and a separate requirement that provides the percentage of pupils who have successfully completed both A through G and CTE courses. So those clarifications are provided in the summary of legal requirements, and you can access that on our webpage. The link is at the bottom of the slide. All right, we can go on to the next slide. And here we're going to take a closer look at the new budget overview for parents that was posted in March to the CDE website. And the template and the instructions for the budget overview for parents are available at the links provided on the slide. And the template is, again, an Excel workbook that includes 5 tabs or sheets, just like in the prior budget overview for parents templates. And so the screenshot here is from the data input sheet. And you can see that the first section in this budget overview for parents requires budget information about projected general fund revenue for the LEA for the 2021-22 school year. And this is where LEAs indicate totals for LCFF funds, LCFF supplemental concentration grant funds, other state funds, local funds, and all federal funds. The second section, LEAs indicate their total budgeted expenditures for the 21-22 school year, which includes total budgeted general fund expenditures, total budgeted expenditures in the LCAP, and total budgeted expenditures in the LCAP for high needs students who are defined as unduplicated pupils from the unduplicated pupil groups, which are English learners, low income, and foster youth. And the narrative that all LEAs will describe about their general fund budgeted expenditures that are not included in the LCAP for the 21-22 school year is included based on these two first sections. So that's the same description that was included in prior budget overview for parents, and will continue. Additionally, if LEAs include less than their supplemental and concentration grant apportionment in their LCAP, a narrative response is triggered that requires the LEA to explain additional actions to increase or improve services for ELs, low income, and foster youth in the LCAP year. The third section requires reporting estimated actual expenditures for high needs students from the current year's learning continuity plan. And if the estimated actuals are less than the budgeted expenditures from the continuity plan, a narrative is required that explains how the difference in estimated actuals impacted the actions and services and the overall increased or improved services for high needs students in the current school year. Let's go on to the next slide. We want to take some time today to provide opportunity for a process check in your LCAP. And we've been going over some of this process check that as we've been meeting with LEAs in our LCAP outreach. And so I wanted to call your attention to the winter section from the document that we have provided in our trainings and is available on our website, called the 2020-21 timeline for the Learning Continuity Plan and the LCAP process. And in the winter section, it really focuses on coordinating the work to gather information the LEA needs to complete the annual updates, including how you're gathering meaningful engagement, information about how you're meaningfully engaging internal and external stakeholders in the LEA's process to understand what was implemented, how resources were used, and the impact of the work in the 1920 LCAP and in the current learning continuity plan. In our outreach with districts recently, we have many districts have shared their process to date and some tools they are using to collect input from those with oversight responsibilities for the actions and from those who are collecting outcome data to report outcomes, and how they're collaborating and collecting information from fiscal to report actual expenditures for the 1920 LCAP and the estimated actuals for the continuity plan implementation. When you look at the winter selection section of this document, you can see that it includes stakeholder engagement and the local board involvement in this annual update process. It's important that stakeholders and boards are kept informed about what the LEA and their stakeholders are learning from their 2019-20 LCAP and their continuity plan, so that they are aware of the local needs in the community and can understand the direction the LEA is taking in planning to prioritize their goals, actions, and resources to address the needs in their LCAP for the upcoming school year. And as you're working to provide these updates, we want to remind you of the requirement to address the instructions included at the end of the template for each of the sections. These are not suggestions. And remember, the prompts on the outward-facing template only provide an overview of each section for the public and do not include the detailed information that is required to be addressed in each component in the LCAP annual update. So please be reminded about paying close attention to the instructions. And overall, because there is so much to process with your stakeholders and your board about the learning from what occurred in the 2019-20 LCAP implementation and the current implementation of the Learning Continuity Plan, we strongly encourage districts to submit this section for pre-review so we can look for how your response is adhering to the template and addressing all that is required, and so that you can have this piece complete and ready to go, so you can then focus on building your LCAP in the spring. You can request a pre-review by sending us an email that you'd like us to pre-review your annual update section, and we suggest you do that this month. And on the next slide, this slide is the third section of the timeline document, and it overlaps winter and spring. And that's because in this winter-spring timeframe, that's when LEAs are focusing on developing the LCAP and using available state and local data and input from stakeholders to develop an LCAP that addresses state priorities for all students and is responsive to the needs in the community and what you learned about in the annual update. So LEAs need to ensure that their goals and actions address the 8 state priorities and include the required state and local data for each of the priority areas. And so coordinating that input, of course, is key at this time. And we also recommend that you use the Summary of Legal Requirements tool, as well as the metric tool on our website, to double check that you're including all of the necessary metrics. You'll also see in this time frame a section addressing stakeholder engagement and the governing board. And these are reminders about the required timelines for stakeholder engagement, especially for input on the draft LCAP, including providing opportunities for input from stakeholders and written feedback on the draft LCAP, as well as that requirement for the superintendent to present the LCAP draft to the parent advisory for comment and to provide written feedback to the committee, and the same requirement to present to the LCAP, to the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee for input, and for the superintendent to provide written feedback to this committee. Also noted is the requirement for a public hearing that must be held prior to the meeting at which the LCAP and the budget are adopted by July 1st. And with this, we invite you to request a pre-review in April or early May. And to request a pre-review, you can email your LCAP coordinator. We will use a download of your draft plan if you're using the eLCAP. If you're using doc tracking or a Word document, we'll ask you to email us a PDF of your draft plan to use for the pre-review. Please do not use the submit function in the eLCAP system, because that submit function is only for the formal submission that you will do following your board approval. So those are a few key components of the process check. And on the last slide is a reminder about the customized support that we are providing. As I said earlier, we've met with many LEAs and have addressed questions they have regarding LCAP requirements and questions they have and guidance for processes that they're using. And we've really learned a lot about what's going on out in the districts, and really encourage you to reach out to us so that we can provide you with support. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne for the FPM update.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. FPM, it doesn't go away. And, everything that's been shared today really, I really like the table that has all that burgundy one, and you may want to kind of pull out some of these slides and print them as your organizer to keep everything organized, because there's so much with state and federal funding. And so FPM, as you still have your Title I programs, and you still have your other federal programs in place. So with FPM, every year the FPM office at CDE reviews and revises the FPM instruments of the programs that are being reviewed. And so today I'm just going to point out some of those changes that took place in this year's, the 2021 FPM instruments, that perhaps you looked at the beginning of the school year when they came out, maybe, and hopefully you adjusted some of your processes that you had in place to reflect those changes. But perhaps today I'm just going to highlight some of those changes in the document for Title I and Title II, the CE instrument and the SEI instrument, the Supporting Effective Instruction instrument. Because again, this is an opportunity for you as your school sites and the districts are revising the school plan, perhaps the LCAP federal addendum, and all of your LCAP, that there is a need to double check the processes that you currently have in place to make sure that you have captured some of these changes. So overall speaking, the two instruments had changes that either provided more clarity in terms of a more focused vocabulary word, and then others added some elements to it that kind of aligned with the reauthorization in 2015. There's been kind of a morphing throughout the years to kind of get everything aligned. So that's kind of an overview of what will be shared today. So in looking at the CE instrument, which is what is used to review the Title I program, again, keep in mind that what I'm highlighting today does not reflect all the changes. In fact, there were probably 15 out of the 20 items that had some form of a change when you compare the 1920 instrument to the 2021 instrument. But just take note, starting with CE3, the private school consultation and participation, the evidence that specifically asks for consultation with private schools, just note that the Title I Part A, Title I Part C, and Title III services needs to be included for under this particular evidence in CE3. And then CE5, the school site composition, one key change was that in the school plan for student achievement, that there needs to be the budget with specific program information that aligns to the school's academic goals and key improvement strategies and the evidence and effectiveness. So again, noting that change. In terms of the CE8, the parental notification of teacher qualification, The parents have to be notified that they have a right to request information on teacher qualifications. And what was added is that if parents are requesting this information, that the parents can also request and receive information about the paraprofessionals in terms of their qualifications. So that's something that was added to the instrument. The next one was CE11, and if you compared, you would have noticed that it looked like it was new, but actually what they did is they pulled this out from CE10 and they actually put it by itself. So it's the allowable use of funds. And I'm going to go over in depth in the next two slides about that. So moving on to CE12, the supplement, not supplant with compensatory education funds. Making sure that when you are creating and you submit those duty statements, that you clearly identify the duties and the activities for the Title I and any other funding sources. If they're multi-funded, you need to, identify those clearly in a duty statement. So that's something that was added for clarity. Probably CE15, the LEA equipment inventory, was probably the one that you really did need to coordinate with other departments if you're not the holder of the historical inventory record, because before it had, the multiple components of your historical inventory list. However, now it's A through L. So the new things this year that you have to add to your inventory list are who holds title, and what's the percentage of federal participation in the project and the costs under the federal award under which the property was acquired. Also added was the use. You had to determine current condition, but what is the use? And then also any ultimate disposition data, including the date of disposal and the sale price or the method that you use to determine current fair market value. So those are some things that you can reflect on. Did you have those conversations with the other departments that perhaps you coordinate with in collecting the inventory record? And then also CE19, and this is the school site council evaluation of program effectiveness. So again, the evidence they have added to this to the instrument is pertaining to the school site council participating in the evaluation. So they want to see minutes and sign-in sheets that clearly demonstrate that the school site council participated in the annual review of your school plan services. So these are, again, some highlights, but there have been many changes throughout the whole instrument. So again, just time to reflect and check your processes in place. So as I said earlier, again, the allowable use of funds was part of the item 11. And so the allowable use of funds. And so CDE has updated their webpage, and here's the link. And basically, for your viewing, I kind of parsed it out. So you have on the left, which is for all schools for Title I program, that your activity and expenditures must be aligned to meeting the challenging state academic content standards, has to be evidence-based, the expenditure has to be reasonable, necessary, and allowable. And then also it must supplement the funds, and also the expectation is the current federal fiscal year, the subsequent fiscal year, the funds have to be used. And then if you have a Title I school-wide program, again, you have the added need to include the comprehensive needs assessment that identifies the needs for the school. And then also it's included in the school plan, that the school plan has been approved by the local governing board. And again, that element of the school site council annually evaluates and monitors the implementation of those actions that you've spelled out in the school plan. And overall, that the activity expenditures have been reviewed, approved, and recommended by the school site council to the local governing board. So this is if your school has a Title I school-wide program. This one is just if you have a school that has the Target Assistance School Program. Again, the first column on the left is what stands for everyone. And then specifically for the Targeted Assistance School Program, you have to have the identified as failing in most at risk of failing students, multiple educational criteria, its ongoing basis and review of progress to make sure that those students continue to be eligible for those services, and then that the staff members paid with Title I funds may assume limited duties that are assigned to similar personnel. So again, making sure that everyone has the latest information that has been updated on the CDE's webpage. Now moving on to Title II with supporting effective instruction. Again, these don't reflect all of the changes. In fact, the 13 items, 12 of the items have been somehow modified. But again, pulling out SEI 1, consultation and staff development, the professional development needs assessment. They want specific documentation of the agenda, presentation, feedback, such as pictures of posters, survey, handwritten forms, and so forth. And the surveys must identify the questions, raw data, and results. SEI 4 is identify and address disparities. So again, they want your current approved LCAP federal addendum, which is now newly added into the instrument because in the past, it hadn't been legally approved by the state board. So now it is. So you have your approved LCAP federal addendum with the inclusion of your data and also the educator equity section of the LCAP federal addendum. And then use of funds. Again, anything that has been used, expenditures with the resource code 4035 needs to be addressed. Okay, and then moving on with SEI 7, supplement not supplant. Again, time and effort records. They want salary and benefits charged in your records. SEI 8, alignment and academic standards. Again, your professional development plan needs to be aligned to state academic standards. And then SEI 10 is the professional growth and improvement. And the evidence for the LEA planning, implementation, and monitoring document must include the evidence that the LEA has implemented the professional growth and that it's showing improvement. So again, these are some key things to make sure that you look back at what changes and what is your process that you have in place for these programs. And moving on to the 21-22 school year. This is the latest from CDE, what they've said in terms of the program instruments. The 21-22 FPM program instruments are scheduled to be released in May, and that there is a new instrument, which is the Title IV Part A, and that will be added to FPMs that are taking place next year. And then also to let you know that because the CARES Act instrument has so many facets of care funding, and as was shared today, that probably will be one instrument that will not be ready for release by May, but all of the other ones hopefully will be released in May. In terms of the LEAs being notified for next year, Cycle B is for online reviews, Cycle D for on-site reviews. And they're planning to notify the superintendents or charter schools by the end of March. So that's this week and a little bit of next week. They're still scheduled to do that. And the status of the pandemic, though, will determine if FPM reviews will be conducted in a telemonitoring format, such as what took place this year. So, but nevertheless, the online and on-site Cycle B and D will be identified as such. For the training for school districts and charters that are being reviewed next year, that will be scheduled for the first week in August, and it will be in a virtual format. So we'll provide you with information in the future for that as well. And any reviews, again, when they are starting, they'll begin in September for the 21-22 school year. Also, disaster relief monitoring will continue, as well as the CARES monitoring. Both of those will continue for the 21-22 school year. And I think that ends it. It's 11:30. So again, we want to let you know that our next meeting will be held on Thursday, April 22nd at 10 a.m. And that we're really glad you're here today. And as usual, we will leave the chat open for a few minutes for any additional questions. And we'll get that Q&A out to you as soon as possible with responses to your questions. And we just wanted to thank you for being here, and we hope that you get some time off and you get to enjoy a spring break.